to DIY Solar Homestead. Today I'm at Kalamazoo Air Museum with John, and he's our guest speaker.
Hi, I'm John. I will talk a little bit about the SBD Dauntless. This particular airplane was used in World War II. Our version of the Dauntless was flown during Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in 1942. The Dauntless is a Navy dive bomber, and as you can see, there's a cradle at the center line underneath the fuselage, and upward 1,000-pound bomb would be put there, or maybe a 500-pound bomb, and there were hard points on the underneath the wings where 100-pound bombs could be attached. Typically, the Dauntless would be flown at an altitude of about 13,000 feet prior to the dive, and when they entered the dive, the rear seat gunner, as you can see there are two machine guns back there, the rear seat gunner would stow those machine guns, turn around in his seat, and then tell the pilot when he was in his dive, he would call off the altitude as the pilot was diving. He would 10,000, 5,000, 1,000, whatever, as they went into the dive. Typically, the pilot would release his bomb at about 2,000 feet. Sometimes he would do it less. The idea was to open the dive flaps, the perforated dive flaps, at the trailing edge of the wing, and that would enable the pilot to control the dive a little bit better. These would typically dive at an angle of 70 to 90 degrees. And the rear seat man would be there calling off the altitude as the pilot was in his dive. After bomb release, the pilot would then yank the stick back and pull out and then try to get away from the target, which hopefully would be exploding. In this case, this SBD-3 right here was used in Operation Torch in November of 1942, which was the very first invasion of a foreign country by the United States in World War II. It's a historic aircraft. The pilot who flew this got a hit on a Vichy French battleship and prevented the battleship from leaving the mooring quay where it was located, the pier. He went back the next day and a different SBD got a hit on a Vichy French cruiser and a Vichy French destroyer, rendering both of those inoperative, leaving and sinking the destroyer. So it's a historic aircraft, and in 1982, when the Air Zoo was looking for a plane to be part of the National Guadalcanal Museum, we talked to the Navy about acquiring a plane from the bottom of Lake Michigan and pulling it up. And when the Navy, eventually we got permission to do that, we contacted a company, a salvage company near Chicago. They went out and pulled the plane up and was sent over here for restoration. It was a 9-year restoration, and at the end of it, this is what it looked like. It was restored back to the original color, original condition that it was flown. However, due to the fact that the Navy was not going to let us fly it, it is unflyable. Part of the engine is over here. This was never replaced, but the original engine is still in the airplane.
How could you restore something that looks like this? That's amazing.
It is amazing. Now, if this had been at the bottom of the Pacific or Atlantic with all that salt water out there, it would have been virtually impossible to bring it up because it would have been too fragile to bring up. There are still airplanes down at the bottom of the Pacific which are war relics, but nobody's ever brought any of those up because either they're marked as grave sites, or the plane's in such fragile condition that they would disintegrate if they tried to bring those to the surface. So it was determined that the Great Lakes being freshwater lakes, this plane was capable of being brought to the surface. And when it got here, we'll show you the picture. Presumably the pilot that was flying this airplane in training thought he was running out of gas and ended up going in the water. And this is the condition of the plane when it came to the air zoo. And when the air zoo restoration crew took the wings off, they discovered 40 gallons of gas. So it's obvious the young pilot in doing the training had switched to the wrong tank.
That's part of training.
Okay, I'm going to take you to the Uss Wolverine model where we will discuss flight training on the Great Lakes.
Sweet. It's way over there.
The Navy had established flight school in Glenview, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago, and in 1942 wanted to have shipping out on the Great Lakes capable of training aircraft aviators. The Navy purchased 2 Lake Michigan excursion boats, one called the CNB, the other one called the Greater Buffalo. I'm going to show you these pictures of both of the Great Lakes steamers. Up here is the CNB, and at the bottom is the Greater Buffalo. These were converted by the Navy to come out as the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable. As you can see, everything from the main deck up has been replaced by a flight deck and a small island. The typical flight deck length for fleet carriers in the war was about 800 feet. The Wolverine and Sable had 550-foot flight decks because they did not need to fly deck loads of aircraft for combat. This was just a training aircraft carrier. And the most unique point about this aircraft carrier was it operated by paddle wheel. You can see the paddle wheel here. These were the only Navy aircraft carriers that operated this way. Of course, at the end of World War II, they were scrapped. And the wooden flight decks were for landing and taking off. It was said that 10 landings and takeoffs qualified you for carrier operations. But more typically, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 would be enough if the evaluators thought you were good enough to do that. So everybody on the carrier was there for training reasons. They were all learning to operate on aircraft carriers. You can see the plane back here that has just caught the wire, and the ground crew is going to push the plane back so that the other 2 fellows back there could unhook the wire. And he would taxi up here, or then take off. I'm sorry. He would take off and practice the takeoff. At the end of the training day, all the airplanes would fly back to Glenview Naval Air Station, and the carrier would come back into port. Now, what's arrayed on the flight deck are the various types of airplanes that were used in training these young aviators. As you can see, Hellcats, Wildcats, SNJs, Corsairs, TBM torpedo planes, and of course the Dauntless. In the case of our Dauntless here that I just got done showing to you, the young pilot was coming in for a landing, and the fellow back at the end of the flight deck is called a landing signals officer, and he has 2 paddles that are basically look like huge tennis rackets, and they are covered with fabric, and the LSO will tell the pilot by hand signals how he's doing and if he's capable of landing. In the case of our Dauntless, the pilot thought he was running out of gas. So he ignored the LSO signal to go around, and he landed on the carrier anyway, on the Wolverine, and somehow his plane veered off the flight deck and into the water. Now this is September 1943, and it is still very cold in Lake Michigan in September 1943. Well, anyway, he managed to unhook his harness, got out of the plane, and he was fished out of the water, but the plane went down on its back all the way down to the bottom of Lake Michigan. Currently, we are in the process of restoring another SBD Dauntless, a reconnaissance version that was on board the USS Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is a very historic battle because it was the first naval engagement in history where neither opposing force saw each other. And that is scheduled to be finished by July 1st of next year. But this was the training cycle for young pilots. And it filled its purpose, the Wolverine and the Sable. These were adequate to train young naval pilots. A lot of them got their wings that way. A lot of them got their chops for landing on fleet carriers that way. And that pretty much covered it. Well, we can go back to the Dauntless, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. What's that?
Yes.
All right, now remember I talked about the flaps. These are known as perforated diving flaps or split flaps. The pilot, prior to going into his dive, would flip a switch or pull a handle, and the dive flaps would open like such. And at the end of the dive, when he's pulling out, he'd close the flaps and continue on his way. And that's pretty much how those work. They were used for that reason only. They could not be used in landings or takeoffs or anything because of the perforation. That didn't add much to the lift or control of the airplane in landings and takeoffs. So they stay closed. The ailerons out there would be used for banking and rolling and things like that. This also has what's known as letterbox slots up there at the top of the wing. I don't know if you can see it too well. That is to help control airflow over the wing and work with the flaps. And up here we'll show you the gunners, where the rear gunner radioman sat. Now the rear gunner's compartment also had the gunner could also fly the plane in an emergency. He had a control stick, and there was a receptacle for the control stick inside, and he would do that. And if in case the pilot was incapacitated, he did have the rear gunner had the capacity to fly the airplane, but I don't believe it happened all that much. The Dauntless had the rear gunner had twin 30 caliber machine guns to work, and he had to be very careful that the machine guns would not hit the tail and riddle the tail.
There's the cable. Wow.
In here was life raft, things like that, provisions for landings on the water. And basically, to enter the airplane, you would climb up on the wing and use this. This is the grip. Climb up here, put your foot in here, and this is a young man's operation. Typically these guys were young enough, 20s, late teens, and they would be able to negotiate all these things. But he would climb into the rear seat and be able to operate pretty smoothly. And like I said, the seat rotated, and when he was going to be calling off the altitude to the pilots, he would stow the guns. You can see this flap, this portion right here, and he would push the guns down in here. They would be stowed so they wouldn't come out of the airplane, and he would turn around and then he would look over his pilot's shoulder and call off altitude as the pilot was diving. It's a pretty neat operation. And it paid off at Midway. The SBD Dauntless was responsible, two squadrons from the USS Yorktown and the USS Enterprise, in a matter of about 6 minutes, either sank or seriously disabled 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 2 of them were scuttled, 1 sank outright, and later on another couple squadrons went back in the afternoon and took care of the other carrier. So Midway was a very crucial battle in the Pacific War. Some people say it was the turning point. I like to think that it was not really a big turning point, but what happened was it stopped Japanese aggression. After Midway, the decision was made to stop at a certain point and just consolidate what they had gained and be on the defensive pretty much for the rest of the war. At Guadalcanal in August of 1942, Dauntless has played another role. The Dauntless was probably responsible for 75% of Japanese shipping losses in World War II because of it died one of the bombs, 1,000-pound bombs. And you can probably see on YouTube various films and videos that show you what flying Dauntless was like. But that's pretty much it about the Air Zoo's Dauntless. And I welcome you to come on out and visit the Air Zoo and see for yourself.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
And you have a beautiful, dauntless day.